Tom Baum called me when I got home from church, and he has COVID also. But he says it's not going to affect the basketball team. He stayed away from them, so I guess we're all set in that front. Pastor Donald, he's going to be in quarantine till next Sunday, he told me, and Holly till Friday. So just keep praying for one another that everything will work out well, and we'll be able to get through all of this and all the things that are happening around us today. This is a big week also. Pray for our country and pray that God will work in every heart and every life through these events that are going to occur this week. And we know that, again, God is the one in charge each and every week of our life, but especially during this week. And let's remember to praise His name for all that He accomplishes for us. Tonight's the confirmation of faith, or the confirmation of the covenant. We might want to use that phrase. Because really this section is dealing with the covenant that God is about to make with Abraham. And Abraham has made a great statement of faith. Remember that last Sunday night? He said in verse 6, and he believed in the Lord, and He counted it to him for righteousness. Remember, God is the one who counted it for righteousness. So here we find that this is a great statement. I mentioned to the books of the Bible that basically the chapters that define that for us, in Galatians there's one, also in Ephesians. So James tells us or explains to us how this statement of this verse is unfolded in these just 5 Hebrew words is all it is. But it really is a great statement that's made and tells us what goes on in salvation. On the heels of that, now God's going to enter into this solemn covenant with Abraham. Because Abraham has exhibited great faith, now God is going to enter a covenant. He's talked to him about this before. The covenant's been mentioned, but this is the actual cutting of the covenant, I guess is what they call this, because of the way the pieces are all laid out. But here He's going to assure him of certainty, and He's going to reveal more of what this covenant is all about. And He's going to give some promises, maybe some predictions, we might say, in verses 13 down through verse 16, He's going to even predict how some of this will work out in the lives of the nation of Israel. And again, the key word here is covenant, no doubt about it. You really can't miss that. And really what you have in the Bible is the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. I'm sure you've heard this before. It's called testament. But the word testament and covenant are basically the same. And so it's the Old Covenant, the New Covenant that we have in Scripture. And of course, we're in the Old Covenant, the Old Testament tonight. So a covenant is something that one person makes, and he's going to fulfill this. And there's either conditional and unconditional covenants. We'll see that as we go. And we'll see what kind of a covenant this is tonight as far as Abraham is concerned. But tonight I got 6 things for you that I want you to notice with me in this chapter that deal with this confirmation that goes along with Abraham of believing God, and he counts it to him for righteousness. First thing I want you to notice in verse 7 is the foundation of this covenant, where it's built. And you find that in verse 7 of Genesis chapter 15. And he said unto him. So I would think this is going to be God speaking to Abraham, even though we don't have the pronoun capitalized in our King James, but that would seem to be the understanding of what this is all about. He said unto him, because of the next statement, I am the Lord. Notice we have the capitalized form of Lord, which means Jehovah, the covenant-making God, the one who keeps His promises. I am the Lord that brought thee out of the land of Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it. This is the foundation of the covenant that God made with Abraham. God's character is based upon the basis of a covenant. God keeps His word. When He gives His word, He makes a covenant, and He's going to fulfill that covenant. And this is His revelation to Abram. Or I should call him Abram. He's not called Abraham yet in Scripture. But this is His revelation to Abram. He says, Abram, I'm going to do something special for you. And He's already started that process, but He's going to continue that as we go through this section. And it's upon this foundation that really everything else rests. This covenant that God is going to confirm with Abraham is the foundation stone, the cornerstone, the basis for all the other events that are going to take place as far as Abraham is concerned and God's relationship with Abraham. And, this covenant, again, is introduced by this name of God. You notice, I mentioned earlier, Lord, and it's all capitalized. And you notice, as you read your Old Testament, the word Lord is used in different ways. Sometimes it's in small letters. Here it's all in capital letters. And so when you see that, it means His unchangeable character. Jehovah, it would be the proper word that we would use for this. Yahweh would be the same idea. They use some other words for that the Jews have. But it's talking about the fact that God is going to keep His promise. And He reminds him, Abraham, remember, I brought you all the way out of Ur of the Chaldees. We saw that back in chapter 12, didn't we? Long trip. He brought his family with him. And, of course, Noah, how do I get Noah in here? Lot was with him. And that would have been a long ways back, wouldn't it, to get Noah in this group. But Lot was with him. And, of course, Lot chose the fertile plains of the valley and Sodom, and we had the whole instance with the king, and still Lot decides to stay there in Sodom and enjoy those things more than staying with where God was at. But he reminds him of that trip, and it must have been quite a journey. Over 800 miles, done on foot. Had his father with him. They come to Haran, and of course his father dies, and he comes on into Palestine, or Israel we would call it, but Palestine would be the proper name for it at this point. And he has journeyed for quite a distance. And Abraham really has already been redeemed. We saw that last week. He's already been chosen by God, and he's believed, so his faith is already exhibited in this situation. And so the redemption has taken place. And this redemption is why God deals with him. This is the foundation stone of God's dealing with Abraham through these days ahead. And God reminds him, Abraham, I'm going to give you a land. Notice that in verse 7, to give thee this land to inherit it. Abraham never really owns any of the land except the grave of his wife Sarah, which he bought from Hittite. But God has given him this promise. And this promise is going to be for him throughout the ages. And this is God's purpose for him. This land is where I want the nation of Israel to reside. Now, this becomes very, very important as even today in prophecy and all the things that are going on in Israel. This is why Israel has claim to the land in which they do, is because of the promise that was made to Abraham all these years ago. And they would still understand that, and that would be the reason why we support Israel having a home in Palestine and Jerusalem being the capital and all the tremendous things that happened with all of that. This is really the basis for that understanding. So this is the foundation. God says, I'm going to give you a land, I'm going to give you a country. It's going to be a grand place. And, of course, it's not happened yet. Abraham's made a journey into Egypt and a number of things we've looked at this point. Still ways to go. After the foundation of the covenant, we have the desire for the covenant, verse 8. Abraham says in verse 8, he said, Lord God, so we notice the word God is added now to Lord, and wherewith shall I know that I shall inherit it? Or whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? Abraham needs a little assurance, doesn't he? God, when am I going to understand? When am I going to have this? God, I need to know this. I need to have some proof in my life that there's going to be a land that I am going to inherit. Now, he really here is making an appeal for knowledge. He says, I need some certitude in my life. I need to be able to put my teeth into this, so to speak. I need to know what's going on here. And he really wants assurance. He wants some kind of a outward sign. He wants some kind of a pledge that God is going to make him to say that this land is going to be his. Now, I don't think we need to consider this unbelief. Maybe we're treading on a little dangerous ground, because when Gideon wants a fleece, we don't consider that to be something positive, do we? And Abraham sort of is looking here and saying, I need some confirmation. I need you to give me some understanding of why or how this is going to be my land. It seems as if he is believing, but he's not really doing so being faithless. There seems to be faith in his life, but he desires some kind of confirmation. I think that happens probably to us from time to time. We need to have God confirm to us certain things. And He does that. But it's good to have Him doing things in a way that helps us to understand who He is, what He's all about, and what He's doing. Maybe it's like the words in Mark chapter 9, verse 24, where the man brings his son to Jesus Christ because he's filled with demons, and he throws himself into the fire, and Jesus Christ says to him, I can't use the exact quote, he says something like, do you believe? And the man says, I believe, but help my unbelief. Maybe sometimes we find ourselves in that same category. Yeah, I believe, but can you do something to help me in this situation? Can you encourage me in this area? Abraham may be in that situation where he needs some encouragement from God to say, yes, this is what's going to happen. This is the covenant that you've made with me, and it's something that I need to have some assurance of. Thirdly, we have the preparation in verses 9 through 10, and this is this understanding of what's going on. You've got to have some local color here to understand what's happening in these next few verses, and we'll look at that here in a second. But it says, he said unto him, and this would be God saying to Abraham, take me a heifer of 3 years old, a she-goat of 3 years old, a ram of 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. A select group of animals are taken here. The heifer especially would later be associated with the Mosaic law. But the other animals are part of the sacrificial system. I was reading Leviticus chapter 5, and again, the Bible I have was showing how these 5 feasts picture how Jesus Christ is a fulfillment of these feasts. And most of these animals are part of those feasts that Israel is told to sacrifice to God, either the peace offering or the sin offering or the trespass offering. And I can't bring up the other 2 right now, but at least those 3 were the last ones that I was noticing. And most of these animals had a part in that. They're in Leviticus chapters 1 through 5. And so he tells him to bring these, and it says, he took them unto, he took, verse 10, he took unto him all these and divided them in the midst, and laid each piece one against another, but the birds divided he not. Now, this is God giving instructions to Abraham. And Abraham is going to obey. He is going to fulfill the requirements that God has given. And it seems to us to be a little gruesome. We're going to lay these animals out here, and they're going to be apart from each other. And it's not something today that you and I probably do, unless you work on a farm. Maybe you do. It's probably the reason why I'm not a farmer, I guess. I don't want to work in those kind of things. But, they lay these pieces out here in this area. And in the ancient world, what's going on is, and this has a lot of, like I said, local color to it. If these people would make a covenant back in this time period, this is how they would do it. They would take these animals and they would cut them apart, and they would put them beside one another. And the 2 persons who were making a covenant together would then walk between the 2 pieces of the pieces of the animal. And of course, the symbolism here is that I am going to keep my word. If I do not keep my word, may I be as these animals are, cut asunder. Okay, so it's the old, remember back when you was in grade school, double dare and stick a needle in your eye and all that. I can't remember how all that stuff went, but it's similar to that. But this is of course far greater than that kind of thing. This would be something that was binding upon the 2 people who walked themselves through these pieces of this animal. And this would be a common way to make a covenant in this time period. This is not something unusual. This is not something out of the ordinary. Now, it is going to be here in a minute because of the way it's performed. Because in the original idea, both would follow through the pieces, making this covenant between themselves. Okay, you understand that symbolism? Saying, we are covenanting ourselves to do this. It's like a marriage covenant or a land covenant. It could be any kind of a covenant that they're making among themselves. And so Abraham, the point here I find is that he obeys God. He gets his animals, he cuts them up, lays them out. Now, he doesn't do that with the birds. We don't know why. I guess because they're so small, but he would put them in the same situation. And he would now wait for God to do something. So all the preparations are all made in verses 9 and 10. After the preparation, now there's the readiness for the covenant, which will be number 4 on our outline. And in verses 11 and 12, he is now ready to make a covenant. God is with him. Verse 11, it says, "And when the fowls came down upon the carcasses, Abram drove them away." So the first thing I notice here is that he's faithful to get everything ready, but he's also very watchful, because we don't know exactly the time period. I don't think it would have been very long, but the time period between the actual dividing of these pieces until he is now ready for this to happen, because animals would certainly come and want to devour that, especially, those who are who are wanting to eat that kind of thing. And so he would have to keep them away, some of the birds and so on and so forth. But it is proof that Abraham is alert. He's ready. He's ready to move through this situation, whatever it may be. And he obeys. He obeys exactly the way God commanded him. And observing the letter of the law is always required. As we, study the Scriptures, one of the points that I've tried to make to us often is that anybody who God used, they obeyed immediately. We'll see in chapter 22 when Abraham is told to take Isaac up to top of Mount Moriah. He does it immediately. He gets up and goes. Mary and Joseph was another example of that. Joseph gets up that night and takes Mary to be his wife. There's always that immediate obedience that takes place in God's family, in God's children. That's a good quality for us. We need to obey God immediately. Not in our time, not when we think it's right, but whenever God tells us to obey him. And so the animals are there, the pieces are there, and he's watching. He's keeping all of these animals from coming in and devouring the pieces while they are laying there. And he's being watchful. And that's another feature. He's waiting for God, and as he's waiting for God, he keeps these birds away, which are other predators that also may be involved. Now, verse 12, and still under the readiness, it says, "And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him." So there's something more here than just sleep going on. God is putting him to sleep, we should say. This great darkness fell upon him, as God is preparing him to give forth a revelation. And this idea of being in a deep sleep is to detach him from everything that would hinder his ability to understand God's plan for him. He wants Abraham's total attention. He wants Abraham's complete understanding. So he not only puts him to sleep, but it's even a great darkness. It's a deep sleep, we may say, that falls upon him, because God is going to reveal something very, very significant to Abraham. And he wants his total attention. You know what that's like. Sometimes when you're talking to somebody, they're doing 3 things, and you say, listen to me. That's sort of what God is saying here. Not that Abraham is doing 3 things, but he says, Abraham, I want your attention. I want you to focus on me. I want you to understand exactly what I'm doing here. And I want you to understand the significance of this, because it's very important that you do. And so we find that he is detaching him from all earthly things, and he is focusing his attention upon God and what he's going to reveal to him. Now here's really the core of what the covenant's all about, verses 13 through 16. And there's going to be a 4-fold revelation that God is going to give. And so here's the message of the covenant. And he is going to give to him his experiences that's going to happen. He's going to tell him what's going to take place. And he's going to even make some predictions here as far as this covenant is concerned as well. For each verse has a different part of the covenant. Let's start with the first one, verse 13. His seed is going to endure affliction, is what you would see in verse 13. So now God is speaking to Abraham in this deep sleep. He says unto Abram, know of a surety. Okay, so when you see that, you say God says, this is going to happen for sure. Know of a surety that thy seed, now who's he talking about, would be the nation of Israel. And those who are going to come from his loin, we saw that back in chapter 12, going to be as the sands of the seashore. We saw that earlier, even back in the first part of verse 15, verses 4 and 5. He talks about the stars of the heaven, them being that way. So, thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. So, he is saying, your seed is going to suffer great affliction. Now, this is written long before Moses. This is the time of Abraham. I didn't stop to figure up how many years, but at least 400, right? They're going to be in Egypt for 400 years. And you're going to go from Moses to Jacob. So there's generations in between here that are going to also be involved. So he's making a prediction that your seed is going to suffer 400 years in a land that you're going to serve them, and it's going to be a time of great afflictions. Now, other places we have 430 years. And then I think in Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7 we have 400. So there's not a discrepancy. What's going on, is it's simply rounding off the numbers, saying it's going to be about 400 years that Israel's going to be serving a foreign nation. Now, we understand. We're looking back at this. He's looking forward to this. All of us know this happened with Jacob and Joseph in Egypt. And they were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. Well, 430 years, if you're going to be technical about it. And so here we find that God is saying, I'm going to give you a land, but you're going to be in a foreign land for 400 years. You know, that's a long time. America has been around, we just went up to 2021, since 1776, so we've been around over 200 years. I won't even try to figure it out. So twice as long as this country, and that's going back to the days of John Adams and Abraham, George Washington, and all these people. You know, it's going back to the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin. I'll get the right ones here in a minute. Benjamin Franklin, these guys who put that's been only half as long as the nation of Israel was in slavery. And it was a long time. And, you know, sometimes I don't think we really think about how long that period was. But they were going to be in this land for 400 years, and they're going to be afflicted. Now, it didn't start this way, but we know the story from Exodus that it ends up this way, and with the whole issue of the Exodus and how Jacob comes down and Joseph's down there. So it's going to be a 400-year period. They're going to be in servitude, bondage, exile, suffering. It's going to be a difficult time for them. Second part of the covenant is going to be this. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterwards shall they come out with great substance. Now, that happened too, didn't it? And this is for them prophecy. But whenever God worked in Egypt, he brought the plagues. And what plagues they were. I mean, tremendous plagues. That you remember, flies and darkness and their cattle dying and locusts. And of course, the last one was the death angel passing over. Remember, at that last time, whenever the death angel passes over, Moses tells the people to ask the Egyptians for things, and they give them to them. And it says there in the book of Exodus that they plundered Egypt because they had served them for all those years. And so God gave them this reward. It's probably some of the things that went in the golden calf, if you look at that part of it too, that they took out of Egypt. I would think so. But anyway, they sort of plundered Egypt at that point. So he says here that they will have great substance. And they did bring great substance out of the land of Egypt whenever they come forth. So God is saying, I'll make a covenant with you, but it's going to take a long time. It'll be 400 years of servitude. And there's going to be finally a great deliverance where I'm going to judge the country that has caused you to have this servitude. But you're going to come out of that country and you're going to have some great substance whenever you come out of that country. Third part of the covenant is a little more personal. It says in verse 15, and thou, so he's talking now to Abraham, and thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace. Thou shalt be buried in a good old age. He's going to experience great peace. This is the first hint that Abraham will not realize the promise. Abraham doesn't realize the promise. Look at Hebrews. says that he longed for a country. Hebrews chapter 11. He longed for a country to find. And he never realized the promise. Again, as I said, the only part he owned of Palestine was where he buried Sarah. And that was this cave of Machpelah. I think it was Machpelah. And that was it. But none of the rest of the promise does Abraham ever experience. And yet, we sung the song, God leads his dear children along. He leads us step by step by step. Full revelation does not come all at once. We couldn't handle it. It would just blow us away. I don't know about you, but I could barely handle tomorrow and this afternoon or this evening, let alone all next week. And so, God just gives one step at it. That's what the song says. He leads his dear children along each step of the way. And he's going to lead us. I have no doubt about that. You don't either. God is going to lead us through the next steps of our life, whatever they may be. And he's going to see us through those steps. He's going to take care of us in those steps. And so Abraham, he says, I'm going to take you step by step. And Abraham, you're going to die and you're going to have a peaceful life. Isn't that a blessing? Not to have a lot of turmoil in his life, upheaval. And you're going to die in a good old age. I think Abraham, I can't remember, I've got to look up how old he was. I think 175 years old when he died. So he's right. He died at a good old age. And so God is giving him these promises. He said, Abraham, this is going to happen to you. One more part, verse 16. And he's calling him into some great patience also. But in the fourth generation, thou shalt come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet full. Abraham, it's going to be a little while. There's going to be 4 more generations of this. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So that would be right. I think I'm right on that. That would be the generation. There's going to be generations going to happen. And those are going to be the ones that lead you to Egypt. So God is basically giving him a picture of what's going to happen in the future. There's going to be 4 generations, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And then there are going to be 400 years, we'll use their language, really 430, but 400 years in Egypt. And then they're going to come back out of Egypt, and that's when you're finally going to have the land. But we're talking at least, he did 175. We're talking 700, 800 years, just rounding it off, until you're actually going to have this land that I have promised you. And God is still at work. But that's the point. God does not work at our timetable. I'm sure sometimes we wished he would. God would like to know this step and that step, and then lay out this step for me, and then I wouldn't mind knowing the next thing. And God doesn't do that, does he? He just makes the promises, and he may deliver some of these promises even after you and I are gone, even after our lives are over. He's going to be faithful to his promises. Just because he has not fulfilled his promise during my lifetime doesn't mean he's not going to do it. That's the kind of God we serve. And so the message of this covenant is, I'm going to give you this land. Abraham, you're not going to experience it, but others will. Last, the making of the covenants found in verses 17 through 21. This is where the interesting part comes in. Well, it's all interesting, but here's the kind of the difference as far as the way a covenant would be made. Verse 17 shows us this. And when it came to pass that when the sun came down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. So this is the difference. Remember I said earlier that in the ancient world, when you made a covenant, you put the pieces and then you walked together between the pieces of the covenant. Abraham's asleep. Okay, you can't miss that. He's been put to sleep back in verse 12. God has been speaking to him in the next 4 verses. And now it comes time for this covenant to be ratified. And notice Abraham is not roused from his sleep and walking with God through the covenant. No, God uses his own symbolic smoking furnace and burning lamp. And it says that he passes through the pieces of the covenant. Now, what is going on here? This is very symbolic, but it's very noteworthy. God is saying that I am going to fulfill my covenant, and it is an unconditional covenant. That becomes important. Because in the Bible, there are conditional covenants and there are unconditional covenants. Noah, whenever he steps off the ark, what does he see? a rainbow. That is an unconditional covenant. God says, I will never, ever again destroy this world with water. He doesn't say, unless you do not obey me. No, God says, I'll never do that. And so, I don't care how much it rains, folks. It's not going to happen. Okay? He's going to destroy us in other ways, but not with water. It's unconditional. Same thing happens here. He walks between the pieces and he says, Abraham, I am committing myself to give to you this land and these descendants. Now, this intensifies itself in the Davidic covenant, which comes later on, and that's more conditional, but this is unconditional. God is simply covenanting himself to say, I'm going to bring this about. There's two other covenants in Scripture. The covenant with Moses would be the covenant of the law, and that's very conditional, isn't it? If you don't follow my commandments, then I'm not going to bless you. He's saying, here's the covenant, and he gives them the law and the covenant all there together, but he says, you must follow what I tell you. And if you don't follow what I tell you, then I'm not going to keep my part of the covenant. And of course, he led them into, as Tim said this morning, captivity in 722 and 586, right into Egypt and Assyria, because they did not keep the covenant that God had given to them there in the law of Moses. The other covenant's found in Jeremiah 31 or 33, maybe 33, 31, or 31, 33, one of those. And it's called the New Covenant, and it's also picked up in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, where he talks about the fact that he no longer writes his laws upon stony tablets, but upon the fleshly tablets of our heart. 2 Corinthians 3:17. 3:7. Should look this stuff up, shouldn't I? Before I start quoting my author to you. But anyway, it's there, okay? Just take my word for it. But that comes out of Jeremiah chapter 31, I'm sure it's 31, where he says, I'm going to, again, write my laws in your heart. I'm going to make to you a new covenant. And that's what Christ was all about, and that's what Hebrews talks about. Whenever you read the book of Hebrews, he's talking about how Jesus Christ is the new covenant. He's much better than angels. He's much better than the law, and he's after the Melchizedekian priesthood and not the Aaronic priesthood. So he's making all these comparisons to Old and New Covenant. But this is the original covenant made to Abraham, unconditional. He doesn't ask Abraham to do anything because Abraham is already what? Verse 6. He's already believed God, and God's put on his account righteousness. Abraham, you've proven yourself. Abraham will fail after this. We haven't even heard about Hagar yet, have we? So there's going to be some more problems. But God is saying, I am going to give Israel land. And this is going to happen. It happened in 1948. That's the right year. 1948, whenever the British finally honored their mandate and gave the land, and it is still there today. And Donald Trump moved the capital to Jerusalem, which is the right thing to do. And it's going to be there. And it's going to stay there, no matter what this world says, because that is God's promise. That's God's covenant with them. So covenants become very, very significant and important to us in Scripture. And then he closes it up with this. In the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, and he talks about the dimensions of this land. The river of Egypt is probably the Nile. There's a river in the Sinai Peninsula that a lot of people identify with this. So it's hard to draw. Most of the time we think of the river of Egypt, we think of the Nile, but this is probably one of those small rivers that's found someplace in Sinai, is the way that most people would explain this. And we know what the Euphrates is, and so it's going to occupy that land. The Euphrates starts all the way up in Syria towards Damascus, so it could be any place in there that this land is going to be theirs. And these other people that you read here are occupying this land at this point, and he's going to drive them out so Israel can have this land. But that's the point of this covenant that God has made with him. And so divine covenants are an important, an essential study of Scripture. And you've got to see them as you work through what God is doing. But let me close with this. There's a divine action, there's a human attitude. First of all, the divine action, kind of summarizing our thoughts this evening. The divine action is this: only God passed through the pieces, not Abraham. Okay? So God is here doing the actual working. This is not between two agreeing parties. if you make a contract, you both look at the contract and you agree to it, and then you sign your name to it and say, yes, we'll do this. And that's not what's going on here. God is making a one-sided promise to Abraham and to his seed. This is a divine promise, and this will have visible pledges of fulfillment as history unfolds. It is one-sided. God promises, God gives, and God assures. We can use all that language here in this situation. But the human attitude, man's part of this covenant is to be a recipient, and his attitude is really a fourfold attitude. I'll give you these four things. That should always be true of our hearts. A feeling of deep gratitude. Anytime God gives to us a promise, we should be grateful, shouldn't we? So our response to any kind of a message from God or a covenant from God should be a deep gratitude, and I think Abraham exhibits that, and we'll see that as we go. Secondly, a response of wholehearted trust. We've got to take God at his word, and we've got to follow what God says. Thirdly, an expression of hearty thanksgiving. Anytime God gives to us a promise, we need to thank him for it. And last but not least, a life of loyal obedience. He demands that we are obedient to him in every part. So we have a response to his covenants that he makes to us. And it's important for us to respond in the proper way. And so this becomes the basis that we find in Galatians, the seed. This is where it all comes from. That's going to be the blessing. And Jesus Christ is going to come from this. And the line of David is involved in this. So this is the foundation stone of all salvation history. It's wrapped up in this covenant that he makes with Abraham. And it all is because Abraham believed God and he counted to him for righteousness. So tonight, when God makes a promise to us, he will fulfill it. He's fulfilled this promise. And one day he will fulfill the promise to the Jews. He's doing that now. He's going to continue to do so. But he will fulfill the promises he makes to us also. Our response needs to be thanksgiving, praise, and thanking him for his great plan, his love for us. Because basically, as you read this, Abraham doesn't do an awful lot to deserve this. He's already messed up a couple times. Now, he's made some good choices too. But it's God's grace, isn't it, when you see what God is doing in his life. And that's God's grace in our life also. Father, thank you